Good evening and welcome to the Woodchuck Report on this fine day of January 12th, 2018. I am your current co-host, V. Chase, and welcome to the Woodchuck Report. So today, the big topic of the day will be net neutrality, which was struck down last month by the FCC chair. But before I get into that, just wanted to talk about a little bit about domestic policy today. In case you haven't known or you've been living on a rock for, well, actually a couple of weeks now, both the Vermont House and the Vermont Senate has passed the marijuana bill. So it will be going to Governor Scott's office within the next week or so. And at that time, he's going to have about 5 days to sign it. If he doesn't sign it, it goes into law without his signature. If he does sign it, it goes into law with his signature. And so only way it's not going into law if he vetoes it. And since he has already said that he's going to accept it, that is what's going to happen. So it looks like it will be going in. Some of the things that will be happening with this new marijuana bill, one of the many things is that Vermont will be the first state to actually allow marijuana through the legislature as opposed to a voter ID ballot. Many states like Colorado and stuff, they put it on the actual voter ballot, and so the people themselves voted for it. Vermont would be the first state in which the legislature itself will go ahead and make it so. So some of the things that this bill is going to have is it's going to make it legal for anyone over 21 to possess up to an ounce. They may have up to 2 mature plants and up to 4 immature plants. And it will also allow one person per dwelling to actually be allowed to cultivate, and it will also allow the landlords to deny any type of growing. It will be a misdemeanor crime for anyone to provide marijuana to anyone under 21. And one of the steps after that, once it goes into full law, is that they will work on a fully taxed and regulated market. As a side thing to the 21 rule, I always ask myself, and I voice actively, is what is the point of the age of adulthood if it was at 18? Yet here we have a new bill on top of the drinking bill that states you can't drink until you're 21. Now, I understand that there are many personal feelings about the difference between 18, 19, 20-year-olds and 21-year-olds. But from my viewpoint, if you are 18 or now considered an adult by the state, should that not have full rights of adulthood? Instead, this and also many other laws seem that it's just you're only a partial adult and you're only a complete adult at 21. I mean, so at 18, you can join the military, you can get into legal contracts, you can be tried as an adult, you have almost all full benefits, but somehow you now can't get marijuana or you can't drink alcohol. And some of the arguments I've heard are, people who are 18, 19, 20, do not have the mental faculties, they do not understand the concept of what they're doing, their brains haven't fully developed. If those arguments are true, then shouldn't we shift the age of consent and age of law of adulthood to 21 then, so that your brain is fully developed and you do understand your actions and you do understand what the consequences of your actions are? As libertarians, one of the many things we say is, personal liberty. You have personal liberty to do as you so choose, as long as it does not adversely affect someone else and that you take responsibilities for your actions. We have the freedom of speech, but you do not have the freedom from the consequences of your speech. So we have that. That is my little diatribe against that. But the big thing I want to talk about today is net neutrality, what was and still is in certain circles a very controversial thing. Now, the basics of net neutrality states that it was a principle that said that ISPs, internet service providers, your broadbands, your Comcast, your Verizon, if you're here in Vermont, Otherwise, you have your files and you have your spectrum. There's a whole bunch. They're spread out all across the country. And one of the things that when you start looking at their territories and their customer base, you see that a lot of them are they've carved out little niches for themselves. Very rarely will you see Comcast and Verizon in the same area. Or for Burlington, you have Burlington Telecom, which generally, because it's a public owned, competes against private companies such as Verizon, or even, what's that stupid one? Xfinity, excuse my hatred for them. So one of the things that it said was that ISPs must treat all data on the internet as the same. They are not allowed to discriminate. They're not allowed to charge differently by the users, whoever's using it, the contents of the data, whatever platform the data is being generated from, what application is being used for, or what method of communication that the data is headed to or from. So, and that the ISPs are also unable to intentionally block, slow down, or charge money for any specific contents. Now, they do have the ability to charge contents for what they are allowed per their private data packages. For example, if you want to buy HBO or the Stars package, that's not part of this. All it says that is, Fox News data gets treated the same thing as MSNBC or CNN or some random guy in the bottom of his basement who's putting out a YouTube video with 100 followers gets the same, his data gets treated the same as whoever that YouTube guy with a video about the suicide force. All that data gets treated the same. They don't get to differentiate or pick from. Now, the reasons this came about was that they found that certain ISPs were doing such things. For example, Comcast was cited for slowing down peer-to-peer to file sharings. So peer-to-peer to, if you don't happen to know, is file sharing programs that allow, say, me to share to my specific friends. I don't have to send it to an off-site system. I can send it straight to someone who I know or through the site. So Comcast was found they were slowing those down. And other companies like AT&T was caught limiting access to such programs as applications as FaceTime, and making it so that only paid plan data users of AT&T had full access to it. So if you didn't buy into AT&T's data plan, you had very limited to no access to this FaceTiming system application. So they were found for that. And another big one was the fact that Verizon Wireless was caught slowing down Netflix and YouTube. And one of the things they found out was that because Netflix was competing against Verizon's up-and-coming live streaming or movie and TV streaming service. So they were slowing down their competitors in favor of their own. So there are many more of this, but these are the reasons why that the net neutrality rules came in. Now, what the net neutrality pretty much did was it said that broadband internet would now be classified as a public utility, which would be in the same category as your electricity, your gas, and your water. So those are all public utilities with an actual public access and public benefits. Now, recently, the FCC chair, he was put in place by President Trump, Ajit Pai, they voted for and approved to declassify ISPs from net neutrality, from being public utilities back to what they originally were, which was information services, which is nothing more than a private category. So they're allowed to regulate themselves and essentially become a private entity. Now, there are both sides to the camps. There are many who are in favor and many who are against, and there are a variety of reasons for those. And I have a bunch here that I wrote down so you may understand some of both sides here. Now, some of the arguments in favor was to the control of data, which was to designate cable companies, their common carriers, and so that they wouldn't be able to screen, interrupt, or filter contents. as I said earlier, they wouldn't be able to charge or say, we like your content, we're going to allow you to go, your content is against our censorship policy, so we're going to slow you down. It said, no, all content, all data is the same. Another argument was for digital rights and freedoms, so that what you post was yours and only yours. You had digital rights to sell it or remarket it as is. They couldn't comp it because you were using their system, so technically it was theirs. They said that's one of the arguments for net neutrality. Another one is as the human psychology of slowness goes. As the internet got faster and faster, we all got adapted and used to the fast internet. There's a reason no one wants to go back to dial-up. We all know how it was slow and how it sucked. So now we have broadband cable, we have faster internet. So one of the things they're saying that is without net neutrality, that ISPs, the internet service providers, could slow down and shift it, make certain content slow. For example, it could make their own services fast with the Verizon Royal Netflix. They can make Netflix slow and their own streaming system fast. Well, of course, human psychology says you don't want slow things, especially when you're used to fast things, this thing being the internet. So you would tend to shift to the faster service, which would be theirs. And since they control since they are the ISPs, they control and gain unfair market advantage. Another thing would be competition and innovation, which stated would allow the ISPs, they can essentially demand a toll for quality or delivery. Google wanted to put out a new product to their users. Well, if they're going through Verizon or Comcast could make them pay to use their service at, say, designated speed. If you're having a 100 megabits per second system, you want your internet to be at 100 megabits. Some of you don't. Some of you have 75 or 50. Doesn't really matter what you are. You have the fastest that is capable at that time. And so if whoever you're going through, say you're trying to use Netflix or Hulu, in fact, it is currently to this day, they do pay these ISPs to not slow them down. And so some of those fees get kicked back to you, the consumer. Another one is to preserve internet standards. Right now, regardless of how you think the internet standard is, it is currently a standard. And so net neutrality, the arguments for net neutrality is to preserve those standards so that the ISPs themselves don't start shifting or remaking the internet as they see fit. Another one is to prevent pseudo services, which will allow in the violation of the net neutrality would include payoffs, as I was saying earlier. You could Netflix, Hulu, whatever content provider would be paying off both the internet service providers to allow their content to go through. So those are one of the many things. And the biggest argument was that net neutrality essentially makes the internet network a dumb network. And by that, they mean that there is no policeman who is watching the highway themselves. So you get from point A to point B. It's what you do at point A and point B that matters. Your transit should not matter. All transit should be the same. Now, there are many arguments against. Some of the claims against net neutrality was that net neutrality did not, all these arguments for net neutrality were not a compelling enough reason to regulate the market. And because that there were significant growing competition among broadband access. Now, I would say, knowing very well that that's not true at all. But that's one of the many arguments against. Another argument against was that regulating broadband services will harm minority communities because it will stifle investments in underdeserved areas. From a market economic perspective, I can already tell that's not true at all. Because if from a profit line, you would want to sell your product to where there's the most people. Why would you sell it to a place where there's very limited people? But that's another argument against net neutrality. Another one is that supporters of net neutrality think that somehow without net neutrality that wealthy and those who are capable of buying this faster internet would have the fastest internet and everyone's would be slowing down. And so that they're saying that this world does not exist. It's not an all or nothing. It's not a fast and slow. Well, we can say prior to that, it was shaping to that effect, where such things as I cited earlier, Netflix, Comcast, a lot of those ISPs were slowing down the competitors. So those who were buying the competitor, who were aligned with the ISPs, were getting the fast service. And those who were not were either had to pay for it or receive the slow service. So another argument against is that congressional action, which was aimed at protecting the best parts of the internet, could interfere with building a replacement internet. There have been some grumblings of what's going to replace the internet. Most of the internet is through HTML, and well, there's a bunch of programs that go through the code that make up our so-called internet. And so there have been talks of what's going to replace the internet. And so the arguments against net neutrality will state that these investments and research for the next internet replacement will be stifled or not happen because of all this government interference, which is kind of a false information, since the internet was created through the military. It was designed for hooking up computer lines. Look it up. It's a very interesting information to figure out, to find how the internet started about. But it was a military government program in the first place. Another argument against is that there will be reduction in investments, and that these reductions in spending will drive down growth, and it will slow down the growth of the access to the internet. Well, anyone who knows will realize that the internet is a must. It's very hard to live in this day and age, especially in America, without some type of internet access. And yes, we all know people who don't have smartphones, who have the regular dumb phones, but even their day-to-day lives require some sort of internet access. You know, it's a rare grandmother, grandfather who lives in the middle of nowhere without some type of internet access. In fact, if you look it up, the dial-up network, people like AOL, Time Warner, still make an unbelievable amounts of money based on dial-up, which to me personally just confounds me, because I remember the days of dial-up, and why would you ever have dial-up if you could get something else? But there are people out there who still have dial-up. Another argument against was that the net neutrality would make it more difficult for ISPs to recoup their investments in broadband network. This is a clear false statement, because it's been reported that the CEOs of a lot of these broadband internets have said to the investors that net neutrality is a non-deal. It actually does not hurt their bottom line, and a lot of them are still both expanding and spending billions of dollars in their networks to improve services and to expand the network. And another argument against was that there would be little incentive to make large investments if these ISPs cannot charge high fees to companies that wish to take advantage of these new services, which we all know is also not true, because there's multiple internets. There's Verizon and Comcast have a brand new high-speed internet, which is, Google has their Google Fiber, which is a gigabyte service, and both Verizon and Comcast, I know in this area, are slowly working on that. And I believe Burlington Telecom may have that, though I'm not quite sure on the pricing scheme for theirs. Another argument against would be that there's already significant growth in competition among broadband access, which is provided, and that there are few significant competitive problems already exist, so there is no need for regulation, which is also not true at all. That one thing you will find that if you look at the broadband and their customer base is a lot of the broadband companies actually eke out their customers to make sure that to avoid as little competition amongst themselves as possible. It is essentially saying that, company broadband A will cover this area, broadband B will cover this area, and broadband C will cover this area. And so another one is net neutrality brushes away the concerns of the smaller competitors who will be subject to taxes, which would raise prices. Everyone gets treated the same regardless. So those taxes, everyone pays those taxes. You're a small company, regardless whether net neutrality you have or don't have, those taxes are still the same. And another one for against was that it will potentially increase taxes for broadbands, which it's been on record that net neutrality is a no deal for them. It's of insignificant amount to them. And then another one is net neutrality has been necessary to. Net neutrality is not necessary because it's another more regulations. That one is true to a fault for a variety of reasons, which segues me into my final point with the last now 9 minutes of the show, and why is this such a controversial thing in net neutrality. And one of the things that for net neutrality is that, for example, that it was classified as a public utility with electricity, gas, and water, is that it is what is considered a natural monopoly. And so one of the parts of natural monopolies, one of the definitions of natural monopolies is that it has the ability of a firm to change a price above what its marginal cost would be. I missed this one. And so one of the things of natural monopolies is that because of high cost to barrier to entry, that there is very little to no competition allowed or physically possible. For example, your water. It's very hard to have 2, 3, or 4 water mains into your house. It's going to take up too much space and it's going to disrupt a whole lot of things. Same thing with your electricity. It's very hard, it's very difficult, and cost ineffective to have multiple power lines into your house. So generally speaking, there's 1 or 2 power lines or power companies in a region. Same thing with gas, same thing with water. And the arguments for that, for net neutrality and the ISPs, is you're not going to have multiple broadband cables going into your house. So, and one of the things that firms are able, and one of the reasons natural monopolies are allowed, besides being natural, is that it allows a single firm can actually produce more than multiple firms at a cheaper price. So even though multiple firms, which will allow competitive market pricing, which would lower prices in general, the cost of doing that would be higher than if a single firm was to do that. So while you lose out on, say, the public welfare, what you gain is that single firm can actually do it at a better business model than if multiple firms were there. So that was one of the reasons. Now, there are multiple reasons that natural monopolies exist. Some of them are physical, physiological, geographical. For example, roads. You're not going to have 3 or 4 highways all going through the same town. You have one highway. Same thing with power lines. You're not going to have 3, 4, 5 power lines going through a neighborhood. You're going to have 1 power lines. Same thing with water, same thing with gas. And so one of the things that government policy comes in is to, well, how do you regulate these monopolies? And so in terms of microeconomic theory, economic theory in general, is that, well, there's generally about 3 different ways to regulate it. There's the optimal price regulation, which it tries to set the price to the market price, which would be less than the monopoly price. Now, if you go into market theory, which goes into monopoly pricing, says that the cost that a monopoly would sell would be higher than if it was at a competitive price. So monopoly price would be higher than the market price. So regulating this, it would state that the government will regulate to the monopoly to sell it at the competitive pricing, which would be less than their monopoly pricing. Now, there are multiple problems in this, because while you have optimal pricing, one of the things that you do have is that there are problems in regulating this. And so a lot of these optimal pricings that the government tries to enact end up being non-optimal, which sets the price outside of that market price. So one of the 3 problems in regulating that is that, one, limited information, and that governments generally are not able to find out, what is the demand pricing, how much is wanted of said product, and how much does it cost for that firm to produce that product at that price, which is the marginal cost. How much does it cost to produce one more unit of whatever you're selling? So another problem with regulating is that of regulating capture. We know this. There are numerous examples of this. I could go on another complete 30-minute diatribe on regulating capture. For example, the FDA, pharmaceutical companies. You can argue your electricity. You could argue your cars or your highways. For example, there are a bunch of things you can argue that are regulated capture. Another big one is taxis, but that's a completely different story. So one of the subs to that is that, many of the regulators, they come from those industries. So you coming from the ISP, current FCC chair, has incentives and is sympathetic to the cause of the industry they came from. He came from the ISP, FCC, IG, PI came from the ISPs. So naturally, he's sympathetic to their cause. Duh. Another thing is a lot of these regulators who, when they leave their jobs, they're going to go right back into that industry. We've seen this multiple times when former reps and advisors to whether it was Clinton, Reagan, it was Trump, will be Trump, or even former President Obama. A lot of these advisors left and went right back to the industry they happened to be regulating or advising for. So one of those reasons is if you are regulating this industry and you're going to get a job in the industry, you in your current regulating profession will want to not annoy them so that you can at least have a job. And we tend to see this from time to time. And the fact that a lot of these regulators rely on the experts to provide their own information for these policies. And sometimes these information is both misleading and heavily influenced by the industry. And another problem is that a lot of these things I've just said are just naturally inherent to the problems, the regulatings themselves, so that there is very little that these prices and regulations will result in actual efficiency. Now, the last is that the regulators themselves are not able to subsidize. It goes back to the monopoly pricing versus competitive pricing. One thing is you will have the firm sell at the competitive pricing, but you will subsidize the difference between their monopoly pricing and the subsidized pricing. But since regulators do not have that ability, you tend to have the problem of you cannot set the price to where it was to essentially, in economic terms, avoid deadweight loss. Now, those are just some of the things of natural monopolies, which goes back to what I was talking about with the net neutrality and why it exists currently. But one of the many problems that it will lead to, in which I do believe, is that we're not seeing that a lot of Verizon and a lot of the ISPs, what they're going to do, this is just my take on it, is they're going to wait because they very well know there will be a lot of public backlash if they start acting upon now that net neutrality has been relaxed. So they're going to wait a while, allow public memory to go away, and then you're going to start seeing slow ticks in various programs you're using. These ticks are going to slow down, and you're going to slow down, and they're going to slow down, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. And then they're going to start coming up with these packages. And these packages are going to be for the normal mainstream things you regular watch. They're going to be at the normal speed, in which you're going to get used to that, you're going to get accustomed to that. And then what's going to happen is some of the things, the accessories that you did like, they're going to say, well, if you want to watch your Netflix, if you want to watch your Hulu, if you want to get your YouTube, you're going to have to pay for it.